Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We start with the first technical session of today's seminar. This session is devoted to strategic implications. To chair the session, we have with us Lieutenant General Ramesh Haigali, AVSM, SM, Deputy Chief of Army Staff, ISNT. The eminent speakers for the session are Dr. Jaydeep Bhattacharya, President, Center for Digital Economy Policy, who will give us an overview of technological sovereignty. Mr. Shankar Agarwal, Additional Secretary, Ministry of Defence, who will speak on technologies for securing critical information infrastructure. Brigadier Harbijay Singh, Deputy Director General, Project Management Organization, who will speak on the topic March Towards Net-Centric Enablement. And Major General Atul Mehra, Additional Director General, Telecommunication, who will brief us about the implications on acquisition policy. Over to the chairperson.
Very happy to begin this session, which is titled as Strategic Implications. We have the first speaker, Dr. Jaydeep Bhattacharya. Dr. Jaydeep is a noted e-governance expert and is president of the Center for Digital Economy Policy Research. Dr. Bhattacharya is also the adjunct professor of IIT Delhi and vice president of the Institute of Open Technology and Applications, Government of West Bengal. Dr. Bhattacharya did his BTech in Electrical Engineering from the IIT Kanpur, PhD from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, IIT Delhi, MBA from the Institute of Management, Calcutta. He is also in the board of directors of FICCI and is the executive committee of MADE. He is an advisor to the E-Governance Center of Excellence of Sri Lanka, that is under the President's Office, and has been conducting training for ADB Institute in Tokyo on public expenditure management. He has authored 6 books and the author of 6 books, including the co-author of the first book on e-governance in India, Government Online, Opportunities and Challenges, which was released by the former President, Sri Abdul Kalam. Dr. Jaydeep Bhattacharya.
Thank you, General Haigali, for those kind words. Is it possible to have the presentation on the screen? Thank you. So when we're talking about the issue of technological sovereignty in ICT, I think the first section itself and General Haigali's talk was quite sufficient in explaining where we are and where we stand, and that was narrated off by what General Gujjar mentioned and what General Kapoor mentioned. So we're quite clear as to what's the issue that we're talking about. I'll go in depth of what are the reasons why we are in such a situation and what is the implication of not having technological sovereignty in ICT. So we'll take one single case of a military requirement where there is need to neutralize the adversary's strategic military capabilities. And that's a case which is aware of it. And obviously there will be some follow. There will be protests, there will be screams all over the world, because wars nowadays are not plain military engagements, but they are political military engagements. All wars have moved more towards the political military side than just plain military side. And taking care of these fallouts become a humongous task. And therefore there is another option of hitting out on the adversary, which is an ICT EC response, where you use the ICT tools and you impact the critical installations and infrastructure, which can lead to devastating effect without really identifying who did it, without having a clear identity of the adversary, without having the fallouts that we have talked about. And therefore, the impact will be as severe. You can have trains falling off because you have attacked the signaling structure. You can have banks stopping because you have impacted the banking structure. And there is no impact from a political perspective. There is very, very minimal impact from a political perspective. So basically, we can use cyber weapons. Now, is that something futuristic? Are we just seeing guerrilla attacks right now of websites being defaced? And am I being a scaremonger saying, well, it's going to happen, may or may not happen, there's sci-fi, and all we'll have is websites being defaced, and that's not of much of an implication? if you see what happened recently, in Iran, which is a public case, the identity of the strategic equipment was clearly established, the location was established, it's public knowledge. All these pictures have been taken from public domains. The response was not to send in a bunker buster bomb. The response by whoever the alleged adversary is was to send a cyber bomb. There was a cyber weapon that was used to take out the centrifuges. And was not possibly created by only one single nation, if it was a nation involved. Whoever was involved took help from organizations and companies across the world. And that's what technological sovereignty is about. It's not indigenization. It's having the ability to control or have say on technology, which may be extraterrestrial, which may be extrajudicial, but you have sovereignty over that technology due to certain other environmental issues. And the impact on the military strategy is the same as that of the August 6th and August 9th, 1945 attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because while in 44s and 43s they were debating whether nuclear weapons is a reality, does it really exist, and the conference is happening, in 45 there was no doubt left. Those who are thinking were left behind. And as I say, there are people who think, there are people who do, who can do. Those who can't do are people like you who can preach. And we don't want to be just thinkers. We want to go ahead and take some actions on what situation we are in. And did we have a fallout of this fashion when the centrifuges were taken out? Did we have worldwide protests? Did we have riots? Did we have people getting killed? Not a single person died. But the military objective was met. If you go back to Arthashastra, and there is part of the Indian military doctrine, I'm just borrowing from there. Obviously, the role of the military is to focus on threats of external origin. But there are two kinds of external origin. There's external origin and external abetment, which is the case we saw in Iran, or there is external origin and internal abetment, which is the Indian Navy leak case that we have seen. And they both pose very, very different kinds of challenges in terms of ICT&C. And therefore, when we are talking about technological sovereignty and the ability to withstand such attacks, there are two different cases that we need to look at, which is not just pure technological situations. There are situations involving the organization, policies, processes, and strategies. It's not things that one can buy off the shelf. It's an entire reorganization that needs to be done. The way of thinking has to change. It's not something that we can go to a worldwide arms supplier and buy off the shelf. It will not work that way, because there can be both internal abetment and external abetment. And this is not something new to the army. This is enshrined in the doctrine. There is understanding that there is future visualization and strategy needed, which must focus on equipment and infrastructure, and the need for preparing for cyber warfare is already built in. But how ready are we? It's been recognized, that's a very important first step, but how ready are we for it? If you look at the financial system, if you had observed what had happened with WikiLeaks, the ability to make payments to the WikiLeaks Foundation was stopped because organizations involved were stopped from making electronic payments. That's a translation of security. Ability to knock off satellites. You would have seen nations who have built missiles to go and hit satellites and bring them down. We don't need that anymore. That's archaic. That's tribal to send a missile up there to take off the satellite. You can do that with ICT&C tools. You can bring down helicopters, you can bring down military equipment, you can bring down healthcare infrastructure, you can bring down civilian flights, and the most dangerous part is the last part, which is a question mark. With the entire brain power that we have in this room, we still cannot identify all the areas that can be hit by ICT and C weapons. So what these areas will be and how do we protect them becomes extremely critical. So what is needed to be ready? If you're not ready, what are the next steps that we can get ready? If you look at the traditional military support by the industry, it has been extremely robust. The Indian Army has been stronger than some of its adversaries because we have a stronger industrial establishment. And therefore we have had many victories. But if you look at the cyber-enabled military requirements from the industry, we are challenged in terms of some of the core technological components. And as General Kocher and General Algeri mentioned in the morning, if you don't have those capabilities in place, then are we going to see those flags in those pictures? It's a doubt. So what is stopping the industry from scaling up? Why isn't the Indian industry able to provide what is a clear requirement of both the civilian government and the military? Because if you look at the structure of global trade and technology, it's not monopolized by one single country. It's driven by the nature of trade and the intellectual property which is created, which leads and feeds into international standards. So when we are in this room, I can see at least 50-55 standards which are in operation. The way the picture is being shown, the way the colors are being formed, the way the characters are being displayed, they're all standards. Can you go and create your own standard and your own technology and assume that it will work with this ecosystem? It will not. You'll be a pariah. You'll be an outsider. Your technology will be worth nothing because it will not work with the existing system. It has to be part of the international standards, but those international standards already have patents on it, which leads to very significant royalties coming in and also antitrust motions coming in. And the royalties feed into a nice war chest which helps in bringing out new intellectual property. And it's a virtuous cycle for organizations involved, so it's very good for them. But for outsiders and for latecomers, it's not a very pleasant situation, which is the challenge that the Indian industry faces. And we have seen how newcomers are blocked. And this is not just an Indian scenario, this is a global scenario. These are not very India-specific issues, these are global issues. We saw how patents were used to block newcomers, and the patents were, from a layman perspective, pretty trivial. A block with rounded corners is my design. If anybody else copies another block of rounded design, then they are violating my patent, so they will not be able to do what I've already done. And therefore, you cannot enter my block. Which is why being latecomers is not such a good idea. If you go back into history and look at how critical was access to knowledge, the two pillars of industrial revolution, the steam engine and steel making, both suffered immensely when knowledge was not available freely. James Watt, who is widely known to have used his influence to put a patent on steam engine, which is not necessarily his invention as widely perceived, almost killed the evolution of steam engine and became uneconomical to run steam engines because he would not allow anybody else to make any changes to it. And he held that patent because of his influence on the British Parliament for a very, very long time. It was only after 1811 when the patent finally expired and when this technology was made widely available that people started contributing and the efficiency of the steam engine really started going up. And that clearly highlights how important it is to have access to technology. We will not be able to create the next generation of technology if we don't have access to this generation of technology. And what I would call as nanonization. We could create the nano, which is nobody else's requirement. You don't need a nano in the US, you don't need a nano anywhere else. You probably need nanos in Africa and in India and some of these other places. But we could develop a Tata Nano because we have the car technology. If you look at the design requirements, the design criteria and priorities for design trade-off need to be India specific. We don't need smaller and faster, which is not an India design priority in some cases. But we need high temperature and dust proof, which is an Indian design requirement. How many equipment are built with those kind of design specifications in mind? We're simply adopting it. If you look at other cases, why can't we not nanonize moons? Why can't we not create our own robo moons? We know that in the northern part of our territory, the Indian Army is engaged in terrain which is very hilly. Mules are possibly the only alternative. You can't have cars going there, you can't have tanks going there. And mules are extremely important for the local economy also. Why is it that we have not developed it? Last evening I ran coincidentally into one of the major think tanks of the Indian military, Maruf Raza, and I was just discussing this. And I was pointing out, look, the American army never fights in the hills, so they haven't developed it. It's our requirement, and why haven't we developed it? And we all concurred, and we both concurred, and we left. And while driving back, I was thinking, well, that's not true. The American army is actually involved in Afghanistan for a long time. So are we saying that they have also not developed a robotic unit? So back home at around 1 in the morning, I started searching the net, and guess what? I found this. They're actually developing it. It was commissioned last year in 2011. And by 2 o'clock in the morning, I sent off mails to General Kochhar saying, as part of this presentation, that these are already being developed. And then we'll buy it back and we'll adopt it and use it. But this was our requirement for the last 60, 70 years. This is the 50th anniversary of one of the wars we fought in the hills. Why aren't we looking at what is needed for ourselves? Because we don't have the technology to back it up. The technology that goes into it is the same technology that helps in creating segways, of doing the balancing, of having very high-end computing built in so that whatever computing is needed to balance on 2 weeks, the same computing needed to create a robotic unit. So because we don't have technological sovereignty, some of these equipments, we are not even daring to think. It's beyond our dreams. What is required for industry to invest in new technologies? The entire ecosystem needs to be developed. As I said, you cannot just create one piece of solution and say, I'll now take it to market and it's commercialized. Or one single entity to go ahead and develop the entire value chain end to end. As General Kochhar was mentioning, some of the Indian initiatives have all the components which is not Indian. And therefore, to have something which is truly reliable from a compromisation situation, one needs to develop a very significant portion of the ecosystem, which is a very expensive and time-consuming affair. So there are very significant investments that are required. It's a very high-risk environment, because while the industry is investing in such ecosystems, if somebody comes back and says that there is graft involved and there is some insinuations, entire deal will be put off. While the industry still bears the working capital cost of the investment and still bears a greater risk of the capital itself being removed. Similarly, the technology is itself a high risk. If you're betting on futuristic technology and the technology does not work, again there will be issues around impropriety in awarding some of these deals. How can we develop a more mature, robust structure which will be able to address some of these issues which are more organizational in nature? And in the absence of long-term partnerships with Indian military, the Indian industry cannot be responding on a one-off tender basis. It has to be a roadmap on which one has to respond, and therefore are there 10-year deals, 15-year, 20-year deals, which are prevalent in some of the other economies. And it needs to involve all stakeholders. The Indian military, obviously, and what they gain is faster, superior solutions. The domestic industry, as they gain assured business, it's a win-win situation for them. The global industry, because they can take care of the offset clause and the very fact that technology is a global issue. One cannot have technology on a standalone basis. There has to be collaborative engagement. Academia for interesting research and development, and startups. We keep forgetting the startups. Many of the key technologies are brought in by startups, and they in turn get exciting areas to work in and a longer roadmap of products that they can develop. So is it possible to have such partnerships in India? Again, as General Kochhar mentioned in the morning, it has already happened. First of a kind solutions, such as NIB, the Insoft box that they have mentioned, this has already been developed. And there are some pictures of it. I won't go into details because I don't know how much of it is confidential. And it was actually developed with indigenous design, but with leveraging solutions from a global technology firm. The point is, the entire design is under the control of signals, the Indian Army. And that's critical. That's what technological sovereignty is all about. Here's one more picture. And it's not that we're discovering in this particular seminar that knowledge is extremely critical as we move forward and we try to gain technological sovereignty. There's something that's been stated again and again. And if I can just quote from a 100-year-old poem, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, into that heaven of freedom my father left my country free. Written by Tagore almost 100 years ago. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you so much for your patience.